The National UFO Reporting Center, also known as NUFORC, was founded in Seattle in 1974 by Robert Gribble. The center's been collecting first-hand accounts of UAP sightings for almost half a century now, and for its first 2 decades, reports came in primarily via NUFORC's private telephone hotline. Most callers were referred to NUFORC by either the FAA, the military, or law enforcement agencies around the United States. Each call was recorded and logged by Gribble, who also briefly interviewed each witness about their encounter. Now, in this video, I want to take a closer look at one of these phone calls in particular. The call came in on December 6, 1977. The caller said he was a pilot who had just finished a night flight from Tokyo to San Francisco, with a stop in between at Honolulu. He was calling to report something anomalous he'd encountered in the sky between Tokyo and Hawaii. I want to make it clear that the audio you're about to hear was not a radio call-in show. It was a private phone call between 2 individuals, recorded by Gribble for research purposes. It's a fascinating conversation, and while it's not short, I encourage you to stick it out, as there are quite a few interesting details spread throughout. Let's give it a listen.
Reporting Center?
Yeah, you part of the Air Force?
No, sir.
If I tell you if I don't do any good, or does anyone, will accomplish anything?
This is a private scientific research organization, and we're gathering all the information we can on this subject.
No. Do you get the government, or?
No, it's used for private research.
Well, has it helped any in the past?
Oh, yes.
Oh, are you starting to see any patterns or anything?
Oh, we've seen several patterns for many years.
Oh. Okay, well, I'll tell you what I saw then. You can tell me if it's worth a detail.
Okay.
Do you want to ask questions, or should I just tell
Oh,
you?
just go ahead and describe what you saw.
Okay, I'm not supposed to tell you this, but I fly for the CIA. I'm a reconnaissance pilot.
Uh-huh.
And I just came from Tokyo. I just landed about 10 minutes ago. And about halfway between, about halfway in a straight line between Tokyo and Hawaii.
Uh-huh.
I was about halfway, I'm not sure. I was out of radar contact, just on my own alone there. I was still in radio contact, and this is, it's a full moon. I don't know if it's a full moon or not, but it's very bright out there in the ocean. And this thing came up to me, no wings, about double the length of my airplane. I was flying a Phantom S411, but double the length, which would be about 45 feet, round-shaped, not circular, more triangular, but no bottom and no top, all equidistant sides of the triangle. And they weren't sharp, they were sort of rounded off edges. And the ends of it were flat, and no noise, no wings, no thrust, no windows, no, nothing which would give it reason to fly.
No appendages of any kind?
No, nothing.
Okay.
And on the sides of the Phantom, I'm not sure if you're familiar with them, but we do have very high intensity spotlights, which are built into the fuselage. You can see the side of an aircraft. They're used to, when you're loading up bombs at night at the runway, you turn them on so the guys can see things, but the bombs underneath them.
Yes.
And so I turned the lights on the side, and it was there. It wasn't my imagination.
Did the light actually reflect off this thing or
It
illuminate
didn't reflect it. It was a porous material, probably. Well, it looked like sponge rubber, so it looked like. But it was not metallic.
Uh-huh.
It had C4 in it. You couldn't see pores, but it looked like maybe asphalt would look from a distance, something like that.
But I mean, is that light actually illuminated?
No, it just sort of went ahead and hit it.
Okay.
Didn't bounce off.
How close did this thing get?
The closest it got was about 70 feet from the wings. Now I have radar, and it was on radar. And the image doesn't, wouldn't reflect that close, but it got up to about 50 feet from the left wing, and then as far as about 200 feet. It stayed there for about half an hour. Measured at Mach 2.2. It's roughly, 1,900 miles an hour.
Did you see this as it was coming in towards you?
I didn't see him come up on me, no. I just sort of looked over and it was there. And then I looked and looked and looked. I thought, well, it's a shadow or something. So I turned on all the lights on that side. And it was definitely there. I could see the dimension. I could see the top and the bottom and the end of it. The dimensions of the height, I'd say, were, I'd say probably 10 feet. 10 feet by 10 feet.
Okay. Was this thing laying flat, or was it still had the apex up?
It had the apex. It always had the apex up, but it would slowly rotate, and the apex, I think all the time when it was there, it started from the apex being up to the apex completely rotating around. It took about 15 minutes to do it.
I see.
And it would move a little bit, stop, move a little bit, stop, move a little bit, and stop. It didn't look like that was necessary for flight. It looked like that. I think it was just turning for, I don't know why, but it wasn't necessary for flight. You could tell that.
And did it maintain the same position in relation to you while it was doing this?
More or less, yeah, I'd say.
Okay.
But it didn't stay close to us very long. It only stayed 50 feet for about a couple of minutes. It stayed just out of real good sight most of the time. It seemed, I might sound crazy, but they seemed to know what was good sight and what wasn't for me. I have perfect vision 20/20, and I'm a captain in naval intelligence, but I've been working for the CIA for the last 2 years.
Did you get any buffeting off of this?
No buffeting, no turbulence, nothing.
How about instrument interference?
Real perfect.
Okay. Were you in contact with any ground stations for radar check?
There's no radar in that area. I tried 3 times to see if I was in communications with somebody and asked if there was aircraft in my area that was, maybe a little off course. Most aircraft was 400 miles away, they said. And I said, yeah, absolutely positive. They said, yeah, and there was 2 radar ships, but they were both out of range. And oddly enough, he disappeared right when this guy said, well, you'll be in range in about 3 minutes. And about a minute after that, this guy pulled away.
Okay. Did you get the impression you were being observed?
I think they're more interested in the airplane than in me.
Okay.
But I did have that impression, yeah. I also had the impression that they knew what was going on. I mean, I know it sounds nutty, but no one else seems to care about it. I've been flying all my life. I know what an airplane is and what it isn't. There's not that many airplanes that can go as fast as that at that altitude, first of all. 2.2 is pretty fast.
Yeah. Did you have any unusual physical or mental sensations while all this was going on?
So,
Okay.
the only thing that sort of bothers me is I haven't slept for about 30 hours. But that's not any big deal for me. I've done a lot before. I just was coming from 2 other missions, and I just hadn't got a chance to sleep. I just wanted to get home. So I've been flying a long time, but I could say I've done that a lot, so it's nothing. I've been able to do that before. So.
Okay. And you definitely say that the surface of that, the texture of the surface was pitted?
Yeah, not big coals, but it was rough.
Rough, okay.
It wasn't metallic.
What was your altitude?
Flight level 510. I did climb a little bit to see what sort of, I was curious. 560,000 feet, almost goes to play at that. If you're familiar with that plane, are you a pilot?
No, sir.
Well, that plane can climb very fast. It's one of the best planes we have. In fact, its actual top speed is classified. But anyway, I gave it full power and put the nose up 6,000 feet. And there's only maybe 8 or 10 other aircraft in the whole world that can keep up with that. And this thing kept up with no strain at all. And no effort at all, kept right next to me. And he started to move almost instantly when I did, like he knew I was going to do that.
Moved right along with you.
Did no problem at all. And when he left me, I went up 60,000 feet, so I stayed there for a little while, and put into a dive to see if I could outrun him. And from 60,000 feet to about 49, I got up to about 3-point-something Mach, which is really moving. He stayed right up with me with no problem at all. And then the guy said, well, you'll be within radar range in about 3 or 4 minutes. And about a minute after that, he pulled away from me, going forward, at least triple the speed with no effort at all. I mean, no acceleration. He just was there, then he was a speck, and then he was gone.
Okay.
At the same altitude.
Do you remember the time on that?
Well, this is about, I'd say 12 hours ago. No, about 10 hours ago.
Okay. And how long did that whole event take place?
I'd say altogether about half an hour, 20 minutes, half an hour. I did get the time, but the time was Korean time. I can't remember whether it would be an hour off if I even gave you the time. It was just, I can't remember if it was 4 a.m. or 4 p.m. It was one or the other Korean time.
Okay.
I can't remember if I reset the clock out when I left Korea.
Okay, is there any chance of getting your name?
Yes. No, wait a minute.
Anything in case we want to get back to you.
You can get to my commanding officer, and he can get to me, but I'm not really supposed to tell you. I'm not supposed to tell you that I was doing this. But my commanding officer name is, and he's Chief of Naval Intelligence at the Pentagon. And I'm always in contact with him. He's my career, and
That would be just sent to in care of the Navy Department.
care of Office of Naval Intelligence, Admiral Collins, Pentagon, Washington, D.C.
Okay.
The main thing I want to tell you is this thing had no, like, you can sort of tell if an aircraft is really working to keep up with you speed-wise. I mean, it sort of has characteristics, but this had no effort at all keeping up with me, and there's no lag. I mean, they can accelerate or decelerate as fast as they want to, go up and down as fast as they want to. But it's not it defied all the laws of aerodynamics. There's no reason for it to fly.
Okay, when this thing pulled away from you, was it high speed?
Yeah, it was next to me. Within 10 seconds, it was a speck, and a speck on the radar. The radar screen I had is about 150-mile range. I can tell the speed exactly. It took it less than 10 seconds to get off the radar range. Less than 10 seconds to go 150 miles. And I saw it going across the radar range. And then we have on the radar you can, there's 3 modes. There's 150 miles, there's 250 miles, and 500 miles. And so to see it on the 500-mile range, I upped the range from 150 to 500. And the time it took me to flip the switch, which is another 3 seconds, they'd already gone past the 500-mile range. It wasn't on the radar anymore. Which means they've already gone through that other ring. You can imagine a circle, 500-mile circle around you. That's what it's like. And we have intelligence radar, which is the best you can get. I mean, you can pick up a skydiver 400 miles away, free falling skydiver, it'll pick up on our radar.
Did this thing leave any trail as it took off?
We have Hawker heat-sensing missiles, and the heat-sensing missile has a computer which can track the exhaust of a jet. The exhaust of the jet stays in the sky the same way a weight in water stays in water. You can track it the same way. Well, that computer was on too, and there was no thrust, no heat, no energy coming from this.
Okay.
But this thing will sense heat up to 20 miles away at that altitude, and there's no heat coming out of it. And that's very sensitive also. And you can start up a gasoline engine, in a car 20 miles away from this thing, and turn on the missile, it'll find the heat and blow it up. That's how accurate it is.
Okay, did you get a good solid return on your radar?
Perfect, yeah.
Okay.
What surprised me, but it was perfect.
Okay, I can tell you that just from the research and data bank information that we keep, that the triangular-shaped object is becoming quite common.
Someone else has seen it, you mean?
Pardon?
Someone else has seen it?
The triangular-shaped object has been seen many times.
Oh.
I'm a little surprised that you didn't see some kind of colored light system on it, because
No light.
no lights, okay. But they're getting to be quite a common object reported by witnesses.
Do you have any idea where they come from?
Oh no, those associated in the field of ufology are kicking around all kinds of theories. Some think they're from outer space, and some think they're some sort of a time travel or something coming from another dimension or a parallel universe. So
I'm not the only one that's seen these things. Well, that's good to know.
Oh yes, they've been seen at close range by ground witnesses.
Yeah, well, do you have a magazine or anything you print?
We put out a publication periodically to keep people up on the latest events.
Could I receive that?
Oh, sure.
Could you send it to my brother? Would that be okay?
Sure.
Okay, why don't you send it to,
Sure, we'll do.
yeah, I don't know if it helped me to tell you this, but, the people at the approach control, the Navy, they didn't seem to care.
Was this in Honolulu?
Well, Honolulu approach control, and Honolulu, the Navy there didn't seem to care. And the same thing in San Francisco.
Okay, did you get our numbers from the people in San Francisco?
Or Honolulu.
Honolulu. Well, I think that the people that are associated with flight controls, FAA, and so forth, they've been hung up, given so much responsibility in this field, and that's given them such a headache over the years. They're trying to get it off of their back. It seems like every time the FAA gets in the press associated with UFO sightings, and these people at the various FAA facilities are hounded by the public and answering, they're doing more time answering the phone in relation to UFOs than they're taking care of their job.
I wanted to speed up and get around him and see what the other side of the thing looked like. But I could not run him. He could slow down and speed up as fast as I could. A Phantom can go from 2.2 Mach to 50 miles an hour in about 10 seconds. That's how fast he can slow down if you wanted to. And I tried that, and he slowed down fast. There's very few airplanes that can keep up with the Phantom. There's no Russian airplanes that can. So either it's one of ours or it's somewhere else. But like I said, there's no reason for it to fly. It has no energy coming out of it, no heat, no power source, nothing.
Yeah, a lot of scientists that are working in this field that they seem that are associated with some kind of a technology which has laws of physics completely different from our own.
Well, has anyone ever reported, seeing one up close and touching it?
Oh yes, it's not a common thing. Close approaches are common, but having the opportunity to touch one is not. But it has happened.
And what did it feel like?
Well, all of those that we have on record claim that it appeared to them to be a very solid or a metallic object of some kind.
Someday one of them has to land and talk to somebody, right?
Well, there's claims of that too, but unfortunately there's just no physical evidence to back it up. And that's what the scientific community wants right now. There's a mountain of statistical evidence in relation to this subject, plus a lot of good photographs, and there's some good films around, and qualified witnesses to the testimony who have seen these at close range. But the scientists, the scientific community in general, they want physical evidence, which seems to be very hard to come by.
Well, probably not not crazy. At least somebody else has seen what I have. So.
Well, we sure appreciate the report.
Well, good. Well, thank you very much.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I still remember the first time I heard that call because it just struck me as pretty compelling evidence that pilots truly are encountering strange things in our skies. I mean, assuming the caller is telling the truth is really the exact kind of evidence you want, which is a detailed account from a highly trained observer. I've always been especially fascinated by the caller's description of the craft's surface, describing it as looking like sponge rubber or like asphalt would look from a distance. There have been many reports of dark gray craft over the decades, but there haven't really been that many accounts that offer this kind of specific detail about the surface texture. We also get a pretty detailed description of the craft itself, though I'm going to talk more about that in just a bit. Before we go any further though, I want to play you another recording I stumbled onto while conducting research for this video. It's a call the center received 2 months before the call we just heard. This one came in on October 20th, 1977, and don't worry, it's significantly shorter than the previous call. Let's give it a listen.
UFO Reporting Center?
Yeah, I got your number from LA Center.
Yes, sir.
And they said you might be interested in something I saw.
You bet we would.
Okay, I have my own jet. I own a Lear 35.
Yes.
And, do you know where the thermal VOR is?
Yes.
Okay. We were just there about 2 hours ago, and that's flight level 430. And it might sound nuts to you, but there was something that, not very far away from us, for about 10 minutes, but double the size of the 747. It was round, cigar-shaped, no thrust, no wings, no cockpit. Had no trouble at all moving. And we saw it off in the distance. It's not a full moon at night. We saw it off in the distance, and there was no lights on it. We weren't sure what it was. And as it got closer, we saw that it was, something.
Yes.
And he followed us along. He got close to us, and we asked the center what that target was. And they said there's no target there. And we said, yes, there is a target. And they said, no, there's no target. So then we asked them to switch onto the primary radar, which to pick up targets without a transponder. And they did, and there's still no target. And He, or it was, right next to us for about 10 or 15 minutes.
Okay, what was your altitude?
43,000.
Okay. And what was your destination?
San Francisco.
Okay.
Lived from, Panama to San Francisco.
Okay, now, were you looking at something that was lighted, or were you looking at a solid object surrounded by light?
No light. All we could see was a reflection off the moon.
Okay.
A dim outline, no light.
Was there any question in your mind that this was metallic?
It wasn't metallic. Because on the wings, we have, on the wingtips of this airplane, we have ground clearance lights, which shine out and shine up. And so when you're going and taxiing around an airport, you can see at the end of the wings. And we turned on those lights, and there was no reflection. It wasn't. We could see the skin for maybe about 30 seconds. We could see the skin. It wasn't metal. It was like foam rubber, something that was porous. But we only saw it a second. It was a clear night, but the moon wasn't very full.
Okay.
And then as soon as he got within range, he was going parallel to us. He sort of got a little further away. He stayed about 50 feet from us. I'm serious, 50 feet. And because I was a fighter pilot in Korea, and I know distances.
How about interference with instruments or radio?
And we didn't really see him come up on us. We saw him in the distance a little bit, but we weren't sure what it was. The only reason we even knew what it was because, are you a pilot?
No, sir.
Okay, well, on the back of a jet or any jet aircraft, there's a red rotating beacon, which is required, and the corner of your eye, you see it reflect off the wing every time it revolves. But it started to not reflect the way it had been, and the reason was because this thing had come, it was interfering with the light, and that's how we wouldn't have noticed it if it wasn't for it was different on the wing, the reflection off our beacon.
Right.
So that's how we noticed it. And then we thought it was just darkness. We didn't really think it was a shape. And then they got closer, and it was a shape. And we were absolutely taught that both my co-pilot, and myself saw it.
How long did it maintain that 50-foot distance from you?
Well, it was near there for about 15 minutes. It was only within 50 feet for about 10 minutes.
Okay. Did you actually see this object move away out of sight?
Yeah.
Okay. Which direction was it moving?
Ahead of us, at probably triple our speed. No acceleration problem, no build-up of speed. It just was at our airspeed to, almost
instantaneous?
Instantaneous, yeah.
Okay, what were you traveling at the time?
0.82. You know what that means?
0.82, that's
Mach, yeah.
Mach, right. Okay, could I get your approximate location again?
23 miles north of the Thermobile are.
Okay. Could I have your name, please? About what time did this occur?
Like 2 hours ago.
2 hours. Okay, sir. If we need any additional information, can we feel free to communicate with you anytime?
It's a lot easier in writing. You know it's possible to call me.
Okay. Well, we sure appreciate you reporting this, and if we come out with any additional information as to what you've seen, why, we'll communicate with you.
Yeah, what will you do with the information?
Well, okay, this goes into research. Now we'll gather all the data that we can on this particular report, then it goes through a data reduction system, and that data goes into the data bank and it's used in our research program and relating to the field of ufology.
Okay, well, I can assure you this is not an airplane. He's just too maneuverable and too fast for, and also there isn't seen on radar, which surprised me. We have also in-cockpit radar, we have weather radar, and we had it turned on. There was nothing there.
Still nothing there, okay. Did this thing maintain its density during the entire sighting, or did it change its glow or brightness at all?
No glow, no brightness, just reflection of the moon.
Didn't change at all?
No.
Okay.
I think the closest consistency would be like it looks like a brownie, sort of, I couldn't see the color, but it looked like a porous, like styrofoam or something.
Yes.
It's brown. Well, I don't know if it's brown. I think it's brown or black color. The color that we both of us saw for the instant was sort of a grayish brown, but it wasn't metal.
How many years you been flying?
25, 23.
Long time.
I own a company of my own, and we have 4 jets of our own. I fly myself every day. I was a pilot in Korea, a pilot in Vietnam, and I worked for United as a co-pilot for a couple of years.
All right, sir, we sure appreciate you reporting this, and like I say, if we get any more on it, we'll let you know.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Okay.
Now, some of you have realized it, and some of you haven't, but both of these calls were made by the same guy, 2 months apart. I'm going to play a few short examples from both calls back to back that will hopefully drive this point home. Pay attention to how the voices match not only in tone and phrasing, but also in word choice.
It was like foam rubber, something that was porous. It wasn't metallic, but it was not metallic, so porous material. Well, it looked like sponge rubber. No thrust, no wings. No wings, no thrust. At probably triple our speed. No acceleration problem. At least triple the speed with no effort at all. San Francisco, San Francisco, San Francisco, San Francisco.
It's the same guy. When I first started making this video, I was doing it in the hopes of bringing more attention to the call about the triangular craft, because I thought it might potentially be an important piece of data. But then I stumbled onto the other call and everything just sort of fell apart, which, if I'm being honest, was a bit disappointing. But it does explain why he so casually shared the fact that he was a naval intelligence officer working for the CIA, reporting directly to the Pentagon. I mean, that's a pretty loose lip spy. Some of you may have also noticed inconsistencies in his accent at times. He was able to maintain a fairly nondescript accent for the duration of both calls, but there were a few random moments where an unmistakable northeastern US accent accidentally peeked through. Here's the accent he maintained for most of each call.
We were just there about 2 hours ago. Just sort of looked over and it was there. And there was no lights on it. We weren't sure what it was.
But by isolating a few of the places where he slipped, we get this.
That's flight level 430. 23 miles north, times Siri at 50 feet. And it was on radar.
Clearly a New England accent, maybe Boston or possibly Maine. Now, by itself, this doesn't really mean much. Lots of people intentionally work to minimize their regional accents. But we can say with some certainty that for whatever reason, he was doing his best to obscure his original accent and he just didn't quite pull it off all the way. But, having figured out the calls were fake, I was now faced with a new and intriguing question. Why would this guy do this? The natural first response is simply to say, well, he's a prank caller, there's really nothing to discuss here. But something about that explanation doesn't seem to sit quite right. The calls are essentially the exact same story, with minor alterations to certain details. If he was a simple prank caller, spinning spur-of-the-moment tales for fun, why not craft an entirely different story? Why was he so intent on this specific set of details being shared with Gribble? The more I looked at it, the more I began to suspect something else was going on. Now it's just speculation, but I think it's quite possible this guy may have been a disinformation agent. We know disinformation agents exist, and perhaps the most infamous of them all was Richard Doty, who was an intelligence officer for the Air Force's Office of Special Investigations in the late 1970s and early 1980s.
And one of the jobs of a counterintelligence officer is what the general public refers to as disinformation. Counterintelligence officers are trying to protect the secrecy of what we're doing in reverse engineering of a craft, or developing some kind of special weapons from the craft or some other technology. So for instance, if you're driving along some place close to a test range, such as Highway 93 in Nevada, and you see something flying out there that is exotic to you or not known to you, you're going to immediately think it's either some highly classified object that we developed, or it might be an extraterrestrial craft. So depending on which way the pendulum swings, so to speak, we'll try to convince you one or the other that what you saw is actually a UFO, to protect the real project that we're working on, which is maybe a reverse engineering. It would be one of our crafts, but we're trying to convince you it was an ET. Now, it also works the other way around. When you actually see a UFO, and we know it's a UFO, we know it's an extraterrestrial craft, we're going to try to convince you that it's one of ours. It's something we're developing. So, hey, be a patriotic American and just be quiet about what you saw. Don't spread it around.
So, could the mystery caller have been a counterintelligence agent, similar to Doty? One thing we can say is that he was an absolutely skillful liar. I mean, the first time I heard the call about the triangular craft, I just totally bought it. I honestly thought his tone and pacing felt genuine, and both calls were sprinkled with just enough jargon and specialized language to make them feel authentic. He seems to have had a background in aviation, or at least was knowledgeable enough about it to discuss it convincingly. His references to specific technical elements such as Hawker heat-sensing missiles and intelligence radar may suggest that he did indeed have a military aviation background. At the very least, he seemed more informed than your average run-of-the-mill prank caller, especially in the pre-internet era. Assuming for the moment that this caller was a disinformation agent, is it possible for us to deduce any useful information from what he says? What was his goal with these calls? And who was his intended audience? Gribble explained that the data wouldn't be shared with anyone, that it would simply end up in his database for research purposes, and yet the guy called twice to tell essentially the same story with just a few details altered. What was he hoping to accomplish? Perhaps the caller was hoping the information would travel beyond Gribble, possibly by ending up in NUFORC's newsletter, thereby disseminating the details into the UFO research community at large. Another possible intended target, though, was the Russian intelligence community. It's not far-fetched to suspect NUFORC's phone line may have been tapped by the Russians. After all, any strange craft being seen in American skies might actually have been top-secret experimental aircraft being tested by the US military. And of course the Russians were after every bit of potential data regarding America's secret inventory, as well as the activity of any ET or NHI craft in the area. Tapping Gribble's phone line would have provided a steady stream of near-real-time sighting reports from the US, a potential source of valuable intel for the Russians. If the mystery caller suspected NUFORC's line was being monitored, he may have called not only to speak to Gribble, but also to anyone eavesdropping on their conversation. As far as the message he was trying to convey, it's obvious from both calls that he had a clear agenda and that certain details needed to be stressed. He was pushing the idea that seasoned US pilots were witnessing unidentified craft with no visible means of propulsion that were capable of instantaneous acceleration and speeds of at least 3 times faster than our fastest jets. And maybe most importantly, craft that had a surface that wasn't metal but was porous, like sponge rubber. This was clearly an important detail to him, as it was similarly conveyed in both accounts, even if the details of the crafts themselves differed. In fact, I would say this description of the surface was perhaps the most important detail he was trying to convey, along with the craft's insane capabilities. In both calls, he also took steps to firmly establish himself as a reliable witness. In the October call, he cast himself as a military veteran with decades of experience who had flown in both Korea and Vietnam, but who now commands his own personal fleet of jets and flies every single day. By the December call, he had spruced up his resume a bit and was now a captain of naval intelligence, running reconnaissance missions for the CIA for the past 2 years. He made sure to specify clearly that he reported directly to none other than the Director of Naval Intelligence, the highest-ranking officer within the ONI at the Pentagon. A man, he said, he was in constant communication with. The point of all this was to establish himself as a military intelligence man with a security clearance and access to secrets. And if even he doesn't know what this thing is, well, maybe it's not a US craft after all. And this may be the key to unlocking the entire purpose of these calls. Remember what Richard Doty said. Part of his job was convincing people that experimental military craft were actually extraterrestrial craft. Is that what was happening with these calls? And if so, might that imply that the US possessed exotic craft capable of unprecedented feats of maneuverability? Was the caller's December description of a triangular craft a genuine attempt at describing an actual vehicle in the US secret inventory? Something similar to the alleged TR-3B? Assume for a moment that America had developed such craft, possibly reverse-engineered from recovered NHI hardware. They wouldn't have wanted the Russians to know they'd accomplished this, since maintaining secrecy would have given the US a tactical advantage. And yet, there was a chance of it eventually being spotted by someone. Perhaps it even had been spotted, so US intelligence agents took steps to plant the idea that not only were the strange craft also being spotted by the Americans, but even US military intelligence agents with high security clearances were concerned about it and didn't know what they were. The message may have been, if you see gray craft that look like foam rubber, well, it isn't the Americans, because they don't know what it is either. It probably belongs to the others. And for all we know, that idea may have been even more terrifying to the Russians than the idea of it being American. It's worth noting that while the caller's aviation knowledge seems pretty solid, there are a couple of inconsistencies. For example, regarding his plane, he said,
Now to find a Phantom F411.
Now, setting aside the slightly nitpicky objection that is technically an F4 Phantom and not a Phantom F4, I can't really find any reference to an F411 anywhere. It looks like it never existed, though if I'm wrong, please do correct me. But The F4's full name was the F4 Phantom 2. That's a Roman numeral 2. Suppose for a moment that the caller didn't actually have a military aviation background, but was reading from information that had been provided by someone who did. In that case, he might have easily misread the Roman numeral 2 as an 11, especially if the information was handwritten. Also worth noting is the fact that the distance from Tokyo to Hawaii is around 3,800 nautical miles, but the maximum range of an F4 is only around 1,700 nautical miles, and far less than that if he was burning the kind of fuel required to reach Mach 3. So the math just doesn't really work out there. Another inconsistency. He says he reports to the Chief of Naval Intelligence, and in 1977 this would have been Rear Admiral Donald P. Harvey. On the tape, the name of his superior officer has been redacted, but later on he appears to say Admiral Collins, though it's not entirely clear if he's saying M. Collins or Admiral Collins.
Admiral Collins.
Now, there were a few bits deleted from this section of the tape, so it could be that something else originally preceded that name. Either way, it's odd that the caller should be so knowledgeable about so many details, like the Office of Naval Intelligence, the address, the internal hierarchy, etc., but then stumble on this one verifiable detail. Could it have been intentional? Also, why did he say he was calling from San Francisco in both calls? Caller ID didn't exist yet, so he could have said he was calling from anywhere. Why keep that detail consistent? Could it be that he actually was calling from San Francisco and was concerned that anyone eavesdropping on the line might have the ability to confirm that? Or was there some other reason San Francisco was important to the story and needed to be maintained? Of course, this could all be completely off base, and the real explanation might be far less intriguing. Maybe he was just a very diligent prankster who loved to roleplay. Maybe he was just really passionate about the concept of craft that looked like foam rubber and didn't want to stop telling that story. But I just can't shake the feeling that there was more to the calls than that. There are other possible scenarios that I didn't cover here, and likely others I haven't even thought of at all. But let me know what your take is in the comments down below. What do you think was going on with this guy? Was he a disinformation agent? A simple prank caller? Or was something else going on? I do have more videos on the way, so if you're not subscribed yet, please do so, and be sure to hit the bell so you'll be notified when I upload. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back.